Hello, hello. It is your girl, T. Michelle, and I'm here with my girl, D. Anna. And we're here today. We're going to talk about a topic that comes up often in diaspora circles, and that's whether or not Black diasporans should get free land, houses, or citizenship as a birthright when they come to Africa. I say yes. I look at countries like Ghana, that have a major campaign centered around diasporas making connections to the continent and coming back home. I think that Kenya also has, recently announced that, they want to start making some closer connections to people from the diaspora. But unfortunately, these countries aren't making it easier or more affordable for diasporans to do that. And so I look at Ghana, and they still don't even have e-visa yet. You basically have to, submit an application. You have to mail in all of your supporting documents and passport in, and wait for all of that to be returned to get your visa. And then you're looking at anywhere from $60 to $100, depending on whether you go single or multiple entry visa. And if you need a Russian, it's going to be double that. Same with Kenya. They recently increased the cost of their visa from $50 to $100. So, normally when diasporans are trying to make any type of connection, with Africa, which many of us consider a motherland or homeland, there's, great time and expense involved. And I contrast that, with the country that's been in the news quite a bit here recently. But the country of Israel, which has a law of return, which basically says that any Jew anywhere in the world, no matter where they may be, has an unrestricted right to immigrate to Israel and become a citizen there. And they even have a program called Birthright Israel, where young adults that are aged like 18 to 25, I think it is, who live abroad are able to take free 10-day trips, to Israel to make a connection with their country. And so, once again, I look at that and I compare that to what's happening on the continent with diasporas, and it's just vastly, vastly different. And I think, that's a problem. What say you?
Well, for starters, I got to comment on Ghana. Now, you already know that Ghana not really trying to get you to come home. They want you to come connect with your ancestors' land or anything else. That is a money grab. If people are just doing these diaspora campaigns, come home, because they realize that the diaspora tourism is a multi-million-dollar industry. So I don't expect them to come up with something that's really involved you actually feeling connected to coming home, because that's not their goal. They don't care. But that's just my. But in regards to the question of should diasporans receive land, citizenship, jobs, whatever the case may be, for the most part, I'm going to say no. For me, it just doesn't make sense why we think that people who either were forcibly or voluntarily left the continent, ancestors generations ago, close as maybe 4, worst scenario, sometimes 10 plus generations, should feel entitled to anything. Like we could just spin the globe and be like, you know what, Namibia looks nice to me, or Uganda looks nice, and I should be able to go there and get land citizenship. To me, it's just not logical. And I know people bring up this whole notion of, Israel, but that's a whole thing, because they just stole somebody else's land and not trying to claim it as their own. But even if we look at it in regards to their right to return type thing, that's an individual country. The continent of Africa is massive, and not all countries were involved or benefited from the transatlantic slave trade. So why should all countries on the continent even be involved with this? If an individual country, like similar to Sierra Leone, like the program you went through, where they are allowing people to come there and get citizenship based on DNA tests, if individual countries or kingdoms want to do something like that, I'm supportive of that. But this whole notion of coming back to the motherland and being entitled, no, I can't agree with that.
Well, my thinking is that, we know that certain African kingdoms were actively involved in trafficking and selling our ancestors. And some of those ancestors had land, they had personal goods, and they had everything taken from them, including, their language, their connection to the continent, their entire humanity. And I think that there needs to be some form of reparation for that. The whole purpose of reparation is to restore what was taken. And the primary thing that was taken was their connection to Africa, and by extension, ours as well. And so, I think that this idea of, a citizenship program, you mentioned Sierra Leone. And at this point, they are the only ones that are even offering a formal program that allows diasporans to obtain citizenship based on a DNA connection. But even there, there's significant amount of time and expense involved. Number one, the program requires you to spend 2 weeks in the country, which means that for most of us, that means that we have to take off of work. If you have vacation time, you have to use it. If you don't have vacation time, then that's 2 weeks that you're going to go unpaid. There are travel expenses that are involved. There are document expenses that are involved. But I do think that it is a good program, and I think it's one that can be modeled by these West African and Central African countries that most of our ancestors hailed from. And let's be honest, there are even some East African countries that some of our ancestors are from, because there were people that were trafficked from there as well. But, the point is, I think that there are models that are out there that could be used to establish a real legitimate connection, some legitimate form of, reparation. And I think that, citizenship, land and all those things are just a small part of that. The other thing I think that's important is that, to even establish a connection, to even be able to do some of a program like this means that you have to do a DNA test, which means that you have to you basically have to give up your right to privacy. You have to turn over your DNA to some private company. In the case of Sierra Leone, they do use a Black owned company that says that they don't sell your DNA, and hopefully that is true. But again, there's time, money, just personal expense that is involved in all of this. But I do think that there should be some programs that are set up. I think that something like a diaspora affairs office in these various different countries, that would be able to help diasporans transition back to the continent for those who want to. Those need to be established as well. But I think that it needs to happen. And I hear the conversation a lot of times, people say that, oh, these diasporans are being greedy. They think that they're entitled to this, they think they're entitled to that, and they should get these things free. And they compare what we're asking for to them migrating to the US or somewhere in Europe. And it's a totally different circumstance. They're doing that voluntarily. They're getting on the plane or boat or however they get there, but they're doing it of their own free will, unlike our ancestors who were denied that choice.
You done touched on a few things. I got to touch on. The first one in this whole notion of that diasporans are being greedy. because they feel entitled or whatnot. Part of me actually agrees with that. And I agree with that in the sense that who's to say that your ancestors came from a family that had something? Like who's to say that you would be descended from people who had land, who had this and that? Given the rate of extreme poverty on the continent, there's no guarantee that you came from that. So now you just automatically assume you should be entitled to whatnot, but most continental Africans don't. I mean, we have to get honest about this, especially when you're looking at the regions that people were heavily pulled from during the transatlantic slave trade. The extreme poverty in those areas says no that a lot of people don't have land who are currently there. So now you think that you've been away for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, however many generations, you should be entitled to land, citizenship, etc. For me, I have pause. Even if it came down to individual countries, the citizenship part, I definitely can be more on board with. But I don't think I can ever be okay with individual countries and or even giving land to diasporans just because they have a DNA test. You know, I actually spoke to my husband about this, and he was saying that in his kingdom, there's like so much because land was not necessarily owned by individuals. You know, that's a Western concept. I know that's a big argument down here in Southern Africa. They're saying that the idea of land ownership is not African. Land is owned for the people. It's like by the people for the people. So to me, those are things I think you have to take into account. You want to feel like I should have land, this, that, or the other, when the whole idea of owning it is a Western concept in itself. You know, that's something that I look at when I look at these type of things. And let's say now we move to a point where people are owning land. Is it truly fair that you have continental Africans who oftentimes have absolutely nothing to continue to have nothing, but now we want them to focus on giving people who've been away for so long something? For me, that doesn't sit right with my spirit. But that's just me. And then you mentioned the diasporan affairs situation. All I can say to that is, if they can't get right in stuff right in their own country, like individual, like whether it's the lives, whether it's just paperwork, your child to go to school, etc., etc. Are we really gonna complicate things and add yet another civil servant who just gonna pull a big paycheck but don't really do nothing? Because that's when I hear a diaspora Department of Diasporan Affairs. That's what I see. I see that situation. But more importantly, I feel like the focus for diaspora should be on the idea of reparations that's currently going around. I'm actually quite bothered that for the longest time, African countries have been opposed to those of us in the diaspora getting reparations. Now, all of a sudden, they on board for discussion reparations, but it's for them. That in itself is confusing and nonsensical for me. The claim for reparations should be from us as diasporans, and to me, we focus on that. Focus on getting whatever you might be entitled to for your repair, and if you choose to go back to where you believe your people came from, or where you just feel entitled to because you feel like you have a connection to the African motherland, you can do that with whatever you receive through your reparations claim. But I also feel as though people should be able to go to their non-African ancestors' homeland. If you want to talk about ancestors, right? So for me, I just feel like focus on reparations, and not just this whole notion of returning to the motherland, because not everyone sees it as a motherland. And then if you think about it, you got Africans just giving away their citizenship. Because you have countries like Cameroon where they don't allow dual citizenship. So you see these people risking their life, limb, and everything else to go to a country to denounce the citizenship that you now begging for and feel like that's somehow going to add value to your life. Yeah, no, I'm not even on board. I don't understand the notion. For me, as a diasporan, let's focus on the reparations. And for those who want to go to their motherland, by all means, let them go.
Well, I think if we're going to talk about reparations, then we need to talk about where reparations come from. Because I think that obviously reparations need to come from, these European colonizers uh, who were directly involved. But I think there also was an argument there needs to be some reparation that should be made from certain countries or kingdoms in West Africa or Central Africa that were actively involved in the trade. Because I mean, there just were some that were, and I mean, people don't like to talk about it and don't like to be honest about it, but it's true. And so for
Absolutely.
me, I think that if we're talking about repair, and that's what I see this as, I don't see it as being greedy. I don't see as it being asking things that you're not entitled to. I see this as part of the whole reparations discussion. And the things that were taken from our ancestors, like I said, were, some of them, you mentioned that, this the whole concept of land ownership is a Western concept, and that I can agree with. But even today, there is typically a chieftaincy that controls, land and doles it out as they see fit. Um, and so there is, some aspect of land ownership, whether it be different than what we're used to or not, but it does exist. Um, and so, again, no one ever asks in the European reparations discussion, well, we don't know if your people would have done this or if they would have had that. Nobody says that. But in the African context, why? What's the difference? The bottom line is that what we do know is that they were forcefully taken from the continent against their will and chains. They lost, their languages. Some did lose land. They lost any personal goods that they may have had, and they lost a connection to the continent. They lost that ability to be considered African, and by extension, we did as well. That's something that's valuable to some people. That's something that's not valuable to others. But I think ultimately is for the individuals to decide. But I see this as part of the whole reparations discussion, whether it be European or African. And I just don't see very many people talking about this. Um, I think that, yes, this whole issue about land and people that are there that don't have any land and don't own any, ideally in the ideal world, all of us would get some, because there are vast swaths of land on the continent that are unused. And so, when we talk about why that is, that's a whole another topic for discussion. So it's not like there isn't land there that exists that this could happen for both diasporans and people who are there. It doesn't happen. It hasn't happened because people haven't had the will to make it happen. But I would argue that it needs to happen. And that it's something that the diaspora should be entitled to. I don't see it as greed.
I hear you. I say I'm just on board with you, but I do hear you, and I think that this is definitely a topic that we're gonna have to keep shit out in diaspora circles because you know it's complicated. But the reality is that even the discussion of not all of us were forcibly our ancestors were forcibly removed from the continent. It's not talked about, but especially people from like the current day Burkina, Mali, etc. They were traversing the globe. They were going to the Americas long before the transatlantic slave trade. That was a voluntary move, right? And there's no way to track who left voluntarily, who didn't leave voluntarily. Granted, the majority definitely involuntary were not voluntary, and even with people like to focus and say West Africa, but even Southern Africa, was involved with the transatlantic slave trade. That was the Dutch, you know. So our diasporic circles in the Caribbean and Central South America definitely have ties to Southern Africa as well. But to me, I still feel like any discussion in regards to citizenship and etc. must be done on an individual basis, like country basis, not on this whole notion of the African continent. I don't believe that all countries were involved with the transatlantic slave trade. And so to me, to put that burden on them to feel like, oh, no, you should have to do this because we as diaspora see it as the motherland. For me, that's just, it's nonsensical. But that's just me.
Well, I'll say this. I think that pre-colonization, and even today, many Africans see Africa as one Africa. I mean, before these artificial borders were put in place, people were very nomadic. They traversed the continent all over, and they didn't need a visa to do so. So this idea that somehow again, like I said, I mean, I think that the Sierra Leone model is a good one where people are establishing, some type of DNA connection to the continent. But I mean, I think generally speaking, there are downsides to that. Like I mentioned before, this the whole idea of having to give up your privacy, to give up, your personal DNA to be able to do that. You know, I think there's an argument that that's problematic. Um, But hey, like you said, I mean, these are topics that, need to be discussed. I think that they, need to be brought to the forefront. And, we just need to hash it out.
That's very true, very true, very true. Well, we've come to the end of this tea session. It wasn't served hot because it's complicated. Like I'm like, no, Team Michelle, like, yes. Let us know what you think. Do you think you should be entitled to come wherever you see fit on the continent and get some free land, citizenship, whatever the case may be? Let us know. Remember, if you like what you heard today, even if you didn't like it, like, subscribe, and or share. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the African Tea.
Bye, guys. See you next time.